Blank by Randall Garrett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. Amnesia? Well, perhaps. But how and where had he earned the $50,000? Blank by Randall Garrett. Bethelman came to quite suddenly and found himself standing on the corner of 44th Street and Madison Avenue. He was dizzy for a moment, not from any physical cause, but from the disorientation. The last thing he could remember, he had been sitting in a bar in Boston, talking to Dr. Elijah Komaroff. After the interview was over, they'd had a few drinks, and then a few more. After that, things began to get hazy. Bethelman rubbed his head. It wasn't like a hangover. His head felt perfectly fine. But how in the devil had he gotten here? He looked around. No one was paying any attention to him, but no one pays any attention to anyone on the streets of New York. Still feeling queer, he headed east on 44th Street. He wanted to sit down for a bit, and the nearest place was a little bar halfway between Madison Avenue and Grand Central Station. He went in and ordered a beer. What the hell had happened? He'd had too much to drink on several occasions, but he'd never gone to sleep in one city and awakened in another. Dr. Komaroff must have put him on the plane. The biochemist didn't drink much and had probably been in better shape than Bethelman had been. He glanced at his watch. 2:15. Wow! The city editor would be wondering where he was. He went to a phone, dropped in a dime, and dialed the city desk. When the editor's voice answered, he said, "Hickman, this is Bethelman. I'm sorry I'm late, but—" "Late?" interrupted Hickman. "What are you talking about? You've only been gone half an hour. You sick or something?" "Don't feel too good," Bethelman admitted confusingly. "That's what you said when you left. Hell, man, take the rest of the day off. It's Friday. You don't need to show up until Monday if you don't want to. Okay?" "Yeah," Bethelman said. "Sure." His mind still didn't want to focus properly. "Okay, boy," said Hickman. "And thanks again for the tip. Who'd have thought Baby Joe would come in first? See you Monday." He hung up. Bethelman stood there looking foolish for a full 5 seconds. Then things began to connect up. Friday. It shouldn't be Friday. He cradled the phone and walked over to the bar, where the barman was assiduously polishing a beer glass. "What day is it?" he asked. "Friday," said the white-jacketed barman, looking up from the shell of a gleaming glass. "I meant the date," Bethelman corrected. "15th, I think." He glanced at a copy of the Times that lay on the bar. "Yeah, 15th." Bethelman sat down heavily on the bar stool. The 15th. Somewhere he had lost 2 weeks. He searched his memory for some clue, but found nothing. His memory was a perfect blank for those 2 weeks. Automatically, his hand went to his shirt pocket for cigarettes. He pulled out a pack and started to shake one out. It wouldn't shake, so he stuck his finger in the half-empty pack to dislodge the cigarette. There was a roll of paper stuck in there. He took it out and unrolled it. It was a note. "You're doing fine. You know something's wrong, but you don't know what. Go ahead and investigate. I guarantee you'll get the answers. But be careful not to get anyone too suspicious. You don't want to get locked up in the booby bin. I suggest you try Marco's first." The note was unsigned, but Bethelman didn't need a signature. The handwriting was his own. He looked at himself in the mirror behind the bar. He was clean-shaven, which he hadn't been when he was drinking with Dr. Kameroff in Boston. Also, he was wearing his tweed topcoat, which he had left in New York. A search of his pockets revealed the usual keys and change. In his billfold was $300 in cash, more than he'd ever carried around in his life, and a receipt for a new $20 hat. The receipt was dated the 10th. He took off his hat and looked at it, brand new, with his initials on the sweatband. Evidently he'd been doing something the past 2 weeks, but what? He remembered talking to Kameroff about the variability of time, something about a man named Dunn. And he remembered the biochemist saying that time travel was physically impossible. For a second or two, Bethelman wondered whether he'd been projected into the future somehow. But if he had, he reasoned, he'd still be wearing the same clothes he'd had on in Boston. No, he decided, it was something else. I've gone off my rocker. I'm daffy as a dung beetle. What I need is a good psychiatrist. But that didn't explain the note. He took it out and looked at it again. It still said the same thing. He decided that before he went to a psychiatrist, he'd do what the note said. He'd go to Marco's. After all, if he couldn't trust himself, who could he trust? Marco's was a little place down on 2nd Avenue. It wasn't the most elite bar in New York, but it wasn't the worst dive either. Marco was standing near the door when Bethelman entered. "Ah, Mr. Bethelman! The package you were expecting is here. The gentleman left it." The beaming smile on his face was a marvel to behold. "Thanks," Bethelman said. Marco dived behind the bar and came up with a wrapped package in brown paper and an envelope addressed to Bethelman. The package was about 3 inches wide, a little less than 6 inches long, and nearly an inch thick. He slid it into his topcoat pocket and tore open the envelope. "There should be close to $10,000 in the package," the note said. "You promised Marco $1,000 if number 367 won, which, of course, it did. He got hold of the runner for you." Again, the note was in his own handwriting. He gave Marco $1,000 and left. There were some things he'd have to find out. He went to his apartment on 86th Street and put in a long-distance call to Dr. Elijah Kameroff in Boston. After an hour, he was informed that Dr. Kameroff was out of town and was not expected back for 2 weeks. Where had he gone? That was confidential. Dr. Kameroff had some work to do and did not wish to be disturbed. Bethelman cursed the biochemist roundly, and then went to his private files, where he kept clippings of his own stories. Sure enough, there were coverages of several things over the past 2 weeks, all properly bylined. 2 weeks before, he had written a little article on research being done on cancer at Boston University School of Medicine, most of which he'd gotten from Dr. Kameroff. No clue there. He'd evidently been behaving naturally for the past 2 weeks. But why couldn't he remember? Why was his memory completely blanked out? He had to know. He spent the next 2 weeks running down his activities during the blank period, and the more he worked, the more baffled he became. He had never been a gambling man, but he seemed to have become one over those 2 weeks, and a damn lucky one at that. Horse races, the numbers game, even the stock market all seemed to break right for him. In the blank 2 weeks, Bethelman had made himself close to $50,000, and every so often he'd come across a little note from himself, telling him that he was doing fine. Once, a note he found in his bureau drawer, tucked among the socks, told him to invest every cent he had in a certain security and then sell the next day. He did it, and made another $9,000. It was exactly 4 weeks to the day after he had sat up in the bar with Dr. Kameroff that he found the last cryptic note to himself. It was in his unabridged dictionary, laying right on the page which contained the word he happened to be looking up. "Tomorrow morning," it said, "you will see Dr. Kameroff, but don't expect him to explain anything to you until you have explained everything to him." So he would see Dr. Kameroff in the morning, eh? He'd been trying to get a hold of the biochemist every day for the past 2 weeks, and there had been no results. That night, just before bedtime, Bethelman drank a glass of beer. 1 glass. No more. And that's why he couldn't understand waking up the next morning with a king-sized hangover. He rolled over in bed, moaning, half afraid to open his eyes. "Oh," he said, "my head." "Want a bromo?" a familiar voice asked sympathetically. Bethelman forced his eyes open. The stocky, smiling face of Dr. Elijah Kameroff floated above him. Bethelman sat straight up in bed, his eyes wide. The effort made his head hurt worse. He looked around. He was in the upstairs guest bedroom of Dr. Kameroff's suburban home. He turned to look at the biochemist, who was busily mixing a bromo. "What date is this?" he asked. Kameroff looked at him with mild blue eyes. "It's the 2nd," he said. "Why?" Bethelman looked at the glass of fizzing liquid and downed it. The pattern was beginning to make sense. He had gone to sleep in Boston the night of the 1st, and awakened in New York on the 15th. Then he had gone to sleep in New York on the 29th, and awakened on the 2nd. It made a weird kind of sense. He handed the empty glass back to the biochemist and said, "Dr. Kameroff, sit down. I want to tell you something." Half an hour later, Kameroff was rubbing his chin with a forefinger, deep in concentration. "It sounds wild," he said at last, "but I've heard of wild things before. But what caused it? Do you remember what you did last night? I mean, the night of the 1st? "Not clearly. We got pretty crocked, I remember." Kameroff grinned. "I think you were a few up on me. Do you remember the bottle of white powder I had in the lab down in the basement?" "No," Bethelman admitted. "It was diazotrimolene, one of the drugs we've been using in cancer research on white mice. That whole family of compounds has some pretty peculiar properties. This one happens to smell like vanilla. When I let you smell it, you stuck your finger in it and licked off some of the powder before I could stop you. It didn't bother me much. We've given it to mice without any ill effects, so I didn't get you an emetic or anything." The bromo had made Bethelman's head feel better. "But what happened exactly?" he asked. "As far as I can judge," the biochemist said, "the diazotrimolene has an effect on the mind. Not by itself, maybe. Perhaps it needs a synergetic combination with alcohol. I don't know. Have you heard the theories that Dunn propounded on the mind?" "Yeah," Bettelman said. "We've discussed them last night, I think." "Right. The idea is that the mind is independent of time. It just follows the body along through the time stream. Evidently, what the diazotrimolene did was project your mind 2 weeks into the future, to the 15th. After 2 weeks, on the 29th, it wore off. Now you'll relive those 2 weeks." "That sounds like a weird explanation," Bethelman said. "Well, look at it this way. Let's say you remember those 2 weeks in the wrong order. The drug mixed your memory up. You remember the fortnight of the 2nd to the 15th after you remember the fortnight of the 15th to the 29th. See?" "Good gosh, yes. Now I see how I made all that money. I read all the papers. I know what the stocks are going to do. I know what horses are going to win. Wow." That's right, Kamarov agreed. And you'll know where to leave all those notes for yourself. Yeah, and on the afternoon of the 15th, I'll blank out and wake up in my bed on the morning of the 30th. I should think so, yes, Kamarov said. It makes sense now. Then Bethelman looked up at the biochemist. By the way, Dr. Kamarov, I want to split the money with you. After all, you're responsible for what happened. The scientist smiled and shook his head. No need of that. I have the diazetomoline, remember? You said I was doing experimental work and couldn't be disturbed. Now, just what do you think I'm going to be experimenting on for the next couple of months? The end of Blank by Randall Garrett.